Luke also makes subtle modifications to the Markan report of Jesus speaking about the one who would betray him. Matt 22:21-22. But see, the one who betrays me is with me, and his hand is on the table. For the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to the one by whom he is betrayed. The text does not specify whose hand is on the table, replacing Mark's reference to someone dipping into the dish with Jesus. John, by contrast, clearly identifies Judas in this moment. John 13:26. Luke adds that after Jesus said someone at the table would betray him, Luke 22:23, they began to question one another, which of them it could be, rather than immediately identifying Judas as the betrayer, as Matthew does. Matt 26 minutes and 25 seconds. Luke inserts a scene previously found in Mark 10:41-45. The disciples dispute over which of them should be considered the greatest, Luke 22:24-30. In Mark, this debate is prompted by James and John requesting places at Jesus' side in his glory. Mark 10:38. The episode was so awkward that Matthew shifted it to a request made by their mother. Matt 20:22-23. While Luke omits that detail entirely, choosing instead to place the discussion of true greatness within the Last Supper, without identifying Judas as the one who would betray Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Luke adds that Judas led the approaching crowd, Luke 22:47, as Judas moves to kiss Jesus. Jesus recognizes the act as the signal to the Jewish authorities, Luke 22:48. Judas, is it with a kiss that you are betraying the Son of Man? Judas then disappears from the scene. Luke continues with the Markan account of a disciple cutting off the right ear of the high priest's slave, but adds Jesus' rebuke and healing of the injured man, Luke 22:51. But Jesus said, "No more of this," and he touched his ear and healed him. This act of mercy toward someone coming to arrest him recalls Pope John Paul II's forgiveness of the person who attempted to assassinate him. Likewise, at the crucifixion, Luke alone records Jesus saying, Luke 23:34, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke does not clarify Judas' role further at this moment. According to Luke, Judas meets a violent end as a consequence of his actions, Acts 1:18. Now this man acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness, and falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his bowels spilled out. The Gospel, OFJOHN. The Gospel of John is largely responsible for portraying Judas in an entirely negative light. John does this in several ways, John 6:264-71, "But among you there are some who do not believe." Jesus knew from the beginning who did not believe, and who would betray him. He said, "For this reason, I have told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted by the Father." Because of this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. Jesus then asked the 12, "Do you also wish to leave?" Simon Peter replied, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe, and know that you are the Holy One of God." Jesus answered, "Did I not choose you, the 12? Yet one of you is a devil." He was speaking of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, who, though one of the 12, would betray him. The question of why Jesus included Judas in his inner circle becomes especially acute in John. If Jesus knew from the beginning that Judas would betray him, then he must have allowed Judas to be part of the 12 for that very purpose. Just as Luke had shifted the designation of Peter being called Satan, Mark 8:33, onto Judas being possessed by Satan, Luke 22:3, John presents Judas as being influenced by Satan. Introducing this element earlier than the Last Supper, John reshapes a familiar story from Jesus' time in Bethany, previously told in Mark 14:3-9, or in Luke at the home of Simon the Pharisee, Luke 7:36-39. In Luke, a woman, identified as a sinner, anoints Jesus with costly perfume, prompting criticism from those present. Luke adapts the story to critique the Pharisees, and similarly, John modifies it to highlight Judas' corruption. In John, the story centers on Jesus at the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, John 12:21-8, transforming a scene of attentive devotion into a critique of Judas. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. A dinner was given in his honor. Martha served, and Lazarus was among those at the table. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The fragrance filled the house, but Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" John notes that Judas did not speak out of concern for the poor, but because he was a thief, he managed the common purse and often stole from it. Jesus replied, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." It becomes evident here that both Luke and John take a traditional story about Jesus and, by altering characters and events, adapt it for their own polemical purposes. This suggests that the portrayal of Judas as the keeper of the money bag, who pretends to care for the poor but actually steals from Jesus and the disciples, is more likely a literary creation of John than a historical fact. At the Last Supper, John only needs to note that the devil had already influenced Judas to betray Jesus, John 13:2-2, and he further emphasizes that Satan enters Judas when Jesus gives him a piece of bread dipped in the dish, John 13:27. John has Jesus identify Judas as the betrayer from the start of the Last Supper discourse, John 13:1-2, 4-11, 18-19, 21-30. Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the very end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. During supper, Jesus got up from the table, removed his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. He poured water into a basin and began washing the disciples' feet, wiping them with the towel tied around him. Jesus said to Simon Peter, "One who has bathed does not need to wash, except for the feet, and is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." He knew who would betray him. I am not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but it is to fulfill the scripture. The one who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. I tell you this now, before it occurs, so that when it does, you may believe that I am he. After saying this, Jesus became troubled in spirit, and declared, "Very truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, unsure of whom he meant. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus who he meant. While leaning next to Jesus, he asked, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread, after dipping it in the dish." After dipping the bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. When Judas received it, Satan entered him. Jesus said, "Do quickly what you are going to do." At the table, no one understood why Jesus said this. Some thought, because Judas managed the common purse, that Jesus meant, "Buy what we need for the festival," or that he should give something to the poor. Immediately after receiving the bread, Judas left, and it was night. In the so-called high priestly prayer that concludes Jesus' farewell discourse, there is a brief reference back to Judas, John 17:12. "While I was with them, I protected them in your name that you gave me. I guarded them, and not one of them was lost, except the son of destruction, so that the scripture might be fulfilled." The final appearance of Judas in the Gospel of John occurs during the arrest, John 18:1-12. After speaking these words, Jesus went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a garden, where he and his disciples often met. Judas, the one who betrayed him, knew the place and led a detachment of soldiers, along with temple police sent by the chief priests and Pharisees. They arrived with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, aware of everything that was about to happen, came forward and asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." He replied, "I am he." Judas, the betrayer, was standing with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. He asked them again, "Whom are you looking for?" They repeated, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said, "I told you that I am he. So if you are looking for me, let these men go." This fulfilled his earlier words, "I did not lose a single one of those whom you gave me." Then Simon Peter drew a sword, struck the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus told Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" The soldiers, their commander, and the Jewish police then arrested Jesus and bound him. In this narrative, Judas serves the necessary function of leading the authorities to Jesus, but his role is minimal compared with the other Gospels. There is no kiss of betrayal. He completes his part and then disappears from the story, at least as far as John's account is concerned. Interestingly, Matthew preserves the term rabbi only when Judas addresses Jesus. Mark 14:45 gives Matt 26-49, while Luke omits it completely. Luke 22:47. In fact, Luke never uses rabbi, reflecting the Gentile-oriented nature of his gospel. Matthew even adds a second instance of Judas addressing Jesus as Rabbi Matt 26-25, with no parallel in any other gospel. This deliberate choice underscores Matthew's negative view of Judas. Such a form of address merely emphasizes his status as an unworthy disciple. In fact, Matthew explicitly rejects the title rabbi, arguing that teachers of the law and Pharisees desire to be called so out of pride. Matt 23:5-7. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them rabbi. Accordingly, Matthew emphasizes that this title should be avoided. Matt 23:8. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are brethren. Thus, Matthew underscores that it is Judas alone who calls Jesus rabbi, when Judas actually kisses Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane to identify him to the Jewish authorities. Matthew records Jesus saying, "Friend, do what you are here to do." Matt 26-50, a statement that almost seems to exonerate Judas for the identifying kiss. The irony is heightened by Jesus addressing him as friend, a term rarely used by him. Matthew is also unique among the Gospels in reporting Judas's remorse. Judas returns the silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, "I have sinned in giving over innocent blood." Matt 27-4. When they dismiss his concern, he throws down the pieces of silver in the temple and departs, ultimately going to hang himself. Matt 27-5. As a Jewish gospel, Matthew naturally seeks to present a more favorable view of Jesus' disciples than Paul or Mark. For example, Matthew rescues Peter from being labeled Satan, instead making him the rock on which the church will be built. Matt 16:18-19. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Matthew still retains Peter's opposition to the idea of the passion, along with the rebuke calling him Satan, but he softens the dialogue to make it less shocking and more comprehensible. Matt 16:22-23. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me. For you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. The mark in criticism remains, but Matthew adds context. To justify Peter's response, his comment, God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you, is understandable, and Jesus' explanation, You are a hindrance to me, mitigates the rebuke. Matthew had every reason to defend Peter's reputation, as Peter is, after Jesus, the central hero of his gospel. If Mark cast the first critical stone at Peter, Matthew laid the first cornerstone for Peter's enduring honor, symbolized later in the Cathedral of St. Peter in Rome. The Gentile Church's ecumenical gospel of Luke portrays the public ministry of Jesus as an idealized period, a time not only distinct from the era before Jesus' public ministry, but also very different from Luke's own contemporary context, long after Jesus' ministry. We are familiar with Luke's tendency to idealize the early church after Easter as a remarkable period, one that did not continue into his own time. In his Acts of the Apostles, the early church is depicted as a community sharing all possessions and funds voluntarily, almost like a Christian form of communism. Yet, this was no longer practiced in Luke's day. It was the church's beginning, a period he admired and recalled nostalgically, but not a model for contemporary life. It was not meant to be imitated. Similarly, Luke presents Jesus' public ministry as an idealized past, a time that does not fully extend into the present. After Jesus resists the temptations of the devil, Luke notes that the devil departs until an opportune time, Luke 4:13. That opportune time arises just before the Passion narrative, when Satan reappears to enter Judas, Luke 22:3, and to tempt Peter, Luke 22:31. The period of the devil's absence, corresponding to Jesus' public ministry, is depicted as a paradisiac, unrepeatable, idyllic era, much like the idealized beginnings of the Christian church. This idealized period, free from the devil, closely aligns with the scope of Q in Luke. Q begins at Luke 3:22 with John the Baptist and continues through Luke 20-30, ending just before the Passion narrative. The idyllic period concludes immediately after Q ends. Following the conclusion of Q in Luke 22:30, Luke depicts Satan re-emerging to tempt Peter and facilitate Jesus' betrayal in Luke 22:31. Luke also explicitly revises the mission instructions of Q quoted in Luke 10:1-16. Those instructions had stated, Q 10:4, carry no purse, nor knapsack, nor sandals, nor stick, and greet no one on the road. Just consider how Luke revokes these mission instructions in preparation for the Passion narrative. Luke 22:35-38. He said to them, When I sent you out without a purse, bag, or sandals, did you lack anything? They replied, Nothing. He said, But now, let anyone who has a purse take it, and likewise a bag. And let anyone who has no sword sell their cloak and buy one. For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me. He was counted among the transgressors. What is written about me must reach its fulfillment. They said, Look, Lord, here are 2 swords. He replied, It is enough. In this way, Luke sets the stage for Mark's immediately following account of the arrest. Mark 14:46-47, one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his ear. By rearming the disciples, Luke effectively closes the idyllic epoch of Q, however wonderful it may have seemed, and re-enters the real world of danger and conflict. With Q safely behind him, Luke proceeds to follow Mark through the Passion narrative and moves on to portray the mission practices of the Gentile church, exemplified in Acts through Paul's journeys across the Hellenistic world. Luke's division of history into an idealized past and a more realistic present did not require him to omit the Q mission instructions, though they were now obsolete and formally revoked by Jesus himself. Instead, Luke preserves them, in their most archaic form, Luke 10:1-16. Unlike Matthew, he was not compelled to update them to reflect current practice. Matthew, however, adhering longer to older procedures, had to adjust the instructions to match the passage of time. Most notably, Matthew justifies a mission restricted to Jews, carried out exclusively to the lost sheep of Israel, probably continuing almost until his own time. Matt 10:5b6-23. Go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of Israel. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For I tell you, you will not have completed all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. This mission limited to Jews must be understood as still being practiced by the Jerusalem church at the time when James sent delegates to Antioch to enforce this segregation. At the Lord's Supper, a policy Paul had strongly opposed in Luke's Gospel. Jesus does not tell Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." The parallel scene to Mark 8:33, which would follow Luke 9:22, is entirely absent. Instead, while Satan seeks to attack Peter, Jesus intervenes to protect him. Luke 22:31-32. Simon, Simon, listen. Satan has asked to sift all of you like wheat, but I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. However, it is Judas who becomes the one gripped by Satan. Luke 22:3. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and temple officers about how he might betray him. They were greatly pleased and promised him money. So he consented and began seeking an opportunity to betray him when no crowd was present. Given that Satan had entered Judas, one might expect him to be an obvious candidate for exorcism, such as Jesus performed so dramatically for the epileptic boy. Mark 9:17-29. Even the disciples themselves become skilled in exorcism. Returning from the mission of the 70, they report Luke 10:17-18. The 70 returned with joy, saying, "Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name." He replied, "I watched Satan fall from heaven like a flash of lightning." Among the disciples, the most prominent example of someone from whom Jesus cast out demons, or, more precisely, 7 demons, is Mary Magdalene. Luke 8:1-3. The 12 were with him, as well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chuza, Susanna, and many others, who provided for them out of their resources. It is difficult to take Luke's claim that Judas was possessed by a demon, or Satan, literally, given that Jesus and the apostles freely cast out demons. In other words, Luke's account of Satan entering Judas seems more like a literary critique than a historical assertion. Judas was not truly demon-possessed. Soon afterward, Jesus gives a second clear prediction of his death and resurrection. Mark 9:32-32. He was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be delivered into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him. Then, for a third time, Jesus speaks even more specifically about what awaits him. Mark 10:32-34. He took the 12 aside again and began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise again." Essentially, this functions as a concise summary of Mark's passion and resurrection accounts. Mark 15-16. Scholars generally agree that such detailed predictions were not spoken by the historical Jesus himself, but rather composed by the evangelist and attributed to him. Even Paul's central message, restricted to proclaiming only Christ crucified, 1 Coríntios 1:23, 222, finds its way into Mark, placed directly on Jesus' lips, Mark 10:45. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. After so many references to the crucifixion, not to mention the detailed predictions, it is not surprising that the Jesus of Mark could declare at the Last Supper, Mark 14:21, "The Son of Man goes as it is written of him." Judas, in that case, would only need to be slightly more perceptive than Peter and the other disciples to recognize that it was God's will for Jesus to die for humanity's sins. In fulfillment of the Scriptures, 1 Corinthians 15:3, given Mark's depiction of Jesus' death as both the fulfillment of prophecy and the expression of God's will, something known to Jesus and the 12. With Jesus willingly submitting even to death, it is striking not that Judas handed him over to the authorities as part of this divine plan, but that Mark could present the act in a condemnatory light. Mark 14:18-21, as they sat at the table and were eating, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They became distressed and said to him one by one, "Surely, not I." He replied, "It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to the one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." Yet, according to Mark, if Judas Iscariot had never been born, how would the Scriptures have been fulfilled? How would the divine will have been accomplished? How would Jesus have died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures? 1 Corinthians 15:3. Why pronounce a curse on Judas for doing precisely what he was destined on, what God, and therefore Jesus, wanted him to do? Mark further explains that the Jewish leaders wanted Jesus dead, but needed a way to arrest him discreetly. Mark 14:1-2. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him, for they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." When the arrest finally took place, Jesus mocked them, underscoring that they were merely carrying out what the Scriptures had foretold. Mark 14:48-50. "Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But let the Scripture be fulfilled." Then all of his disciples deserted him and fled. Thus, Judas is actively assisting the Jewish authorities in arresting Jesus with the intent to kill him. From Mark's perspective, this is far from a harmless referral of Jesus to the religious leaders, as might be appropriate in ordinary matters within Judaism. Their goal is not to question Jesus in order to understand his message and potentially release him. Their sole purpose is to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. This plan had been in motion from the start, when the Pharisees and Herodians conspired together how to destroy him. Therefore, in Mark's view, Judas is, at the very least, complicit in the crime. The narrative does not allow for a complete absolution of Judas by portraying him as merely carrying out God's, or Jesus' will. Mark depicts the events in the Garden of Gethsemane with striking detail, placing Judas at the center of the action, and immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, accompanied by a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. The betrayer had given them a signal. "The one I kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard." As soon as he arrived, he went straight to Jesus and said, "Master," and kissed him. They then laid hands on Jesus and took him into custody. It is this passage that has been chiefly responsible for the long-standing negative reputation of Judas Iscariot. The Jewish sayings, Gospel Cutha, first-generation Jewish Christian church, primarily spoke Aramaic, yet no written texts in that language have survived. After all, most of the original disciples were illiterate. Fortunately, at some point, Jesus' sayings were translated into Greek, likely to support missionary work among Greek-speaking Jews. These sayings were eventually compiled into a small collection. Over the past 2 decades, I have worked with a team of scholars to reconstruct this collection. Here's how. The critical edition of Q, published in 2000, presents a reconstructed text of sayings attributed to Jesus. Q does not exist today as a standalone book in the New Testament. It must be pieced together. Both Matthew and Luke had access to the sayings Gospel Q, and they used it alongside Mark in composing their Gospels. Matthew wrote from the perspective of Jewish Christians, while Luke wrote from the perspective of Gentile Christians, creating a kind of ecumenical synthesis. When Matthew and Luke include identical sayings of Jesus that do not appear in Mark, scholars infer they drew from another source. A century ago, this source was nicknamed Q, from the German word Quelle, meaning source. Today, we call it the sayings Gospel Q, to distinguish it from the 4 narrative Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John found in the New Testament. Since Q itself lacks chapter and verse numbers, we use Luke's numbering when quoting it, as Luke preserves Q's sequence more faithfully than Matthew. With no birth narrative, Q begins at Luke 3, with John the Baptist. Thus, the first chapter of Q is called Q3. Its material is scattered throughout Matthew and Luke, concluding just before the Passion narrative in Luke 22, making Q22 its final chapter. The sayings Gospel Q was composed as a guide for continuing Jesus' message through his disciples. It does not present his public ministry as a past event to be described. Rather, it is a collection of teachings to be proclaimed. The focus is on the impact of the sayings themselves. Heeding them is crucial for one's fate. Perhaps for this reason, Q does not name those carrying the message. None of the 12 are mentioned. Not even Peter and, certainly not Judas. The Jewish Church's ecumenical Gospel of Matthw. The Gospel of Matthew appears to have been composed during the period when the remaining elements of the Jewish Christian Church of Q were merging into the much larger Gentile Church represented by Mark. This merging of the 2 Gospels can be seen as an ecumenical effort, reflecting a hope for a harmonious union of the 2 Christian communities. Matthew provides notable additions to Mark's account of Judas. In Mark, the initiative for the bribe is attributed to the chief priests, Mark 14-11, but in Matthew, Judas actively approaches them, asking for a reward. "What will you give me if I hand him over to you?" Matt 26-15. Matthew also highlights Judas at the Last Supper in relation to identifying the one who would betray Jesus. Judas, who handed him over, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." He replied, "You have said so." Matt 26 minutes and 25 seconds, while not fully explicit. The message is clear. Judas will carry out the betrayal. Significantly, Matthew portrays Judas addressing Jesus as Rabbi, rather than using the Greek term Lord commonly found elsewhere in the Gospels. This likely reflects the Aramaic used at the Last Supper, in which rabbi was a term of respect for a teacher or religious leader, without the later specialized meaning associated with Jewish clergy. However, both Matthew and Luke appear generally reluctant to preserve rabbi or rabboni. For instance, when Mark has Jesus called Rabboni, Mark 10:251, Matthew and Luke translate it as Lord. Matt 9:28, Luke 18:41. Similarly, when Peter addresses Jesus as Rabbi during the Transfiguration, Mark 9:5, Matthew and Luke read Lord instead. Matt 17:4, Luke 9:33. In another instance where Peter calls Jesus Rabbi, Mark 11:21, Matthew omits the address entirely. Matt 21:20, and Luke omits the episode altogether. Their lack of understanding appears again when they see Jesus walking on the water, Mark 6:50-52. They all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Even after the miraculous feedings, Jesus expresses frustration with their blindness. Mark 8:17-21. Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes, and fail to see? Do you have ears, and fail to hear? And do you not remember, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? They answered, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? They replied, 7. Then he said to them, do you not yet understand? Mark even emphasizes that Jesus foresaw the unreliability of this inner circle. Mark 14:27-28. You will all become deserters, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. In Mark's telling, not one of the 12 remained at the cross. Instead, Jesus acknowledges that they would scatter and retreat to Galilee. To the faithful women at the tomb, the angel relays his message, Mark 16:7, but go. Tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. In the Garden of Gethsemane, the inner circle of disciples completely failed to stay alert. Mark 14:37-41. Jesus returned and found them asleep. He said to Peter, Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not stay awake for even 1 hour? Stay awake and pray, so that you may not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away again and prayed, repeating the same words. When he came back, he found them once more asleep, for their eyes were heavy, and they had no answer for him. A third time, he returned and said, Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough, the hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. My betrayer is at hand. At this point, Judas the antihero enters the scene. Yet, as Mark's portrayal of the inner circle has shown, none of the disciples appears significantly better than Judas himself. Some have argued that someone as dishonorable as Judas could never have been chosen by Jesus to be part of the 12, let alone the innermost group. But from Mark's perspective, Judas would not have seemed out of place among them. One might at least expect Peter to be depicted in a positive light, since tradition remembers him as the rock on which the church was to be built. However, that image comes from Matthew, who attempts to rehabilitate Peter's role. In Mark, Peter's declaration at Caesarea Philippi, You are the Messiah, Mark 8:29, quickly takes a different direction. Mark 8:31-33. Jesus began to explain that the Son of Man must suffer greatly, be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, be killed, and after 3 days, rise again. He spoke plainly about this. But Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. In response, Jesus turned, looked at his disciples, and rebuked Peter sharply. Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human concerns. Peter, called not a rock, but Satan. What is happening here? The words get behind me, Satan, seem more fitting for Judas. At Mark places them squarely on Peter. On the Mount of Olives, Jesus foretold that the 12 would abandon him. Mark 14:27-31. He said, You will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. Peter insisted, Even if everyone else deserts you, I never will. Jesus replied, Truly I tell you, today, this very night before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But Peter protested strongly, Even if I must die with you, I will never deny you. And the others echoed the same vow. Did Peter remain faithful until the end? According to Mark, no. Instead, he records simply, they all deserted him and fled. Mark 14:50. When Jesus was taken to the high priest, Peter followed from a distance. Mark 14:54. Yet soon, Peter completely failed him. Mark 14 to 66-72. While in the courtyard, a servant girl noticed him and said, "You were with Jesus of Nazareth." Peter denied it. "I don't know or understand what you mean." He went out to the forecourt, and a rooster crowed. The servant girl saw him again, and told those standing nearby, "This man is one of them." But Peter denied it again. A little later, others said, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." At this, Peter began to curse and swear, "I do not know this man you are talking about." At that moment, the rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered Jesus' words, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." Overcome with grief, he broke down and wept. Given how Mark depicts Peter, it would hardly have been shocking if Peter, like Judas, had gone out and ended his life. Since both had publicly failed Jesus, yet unlike Judas, Peter lived to witness redemption and a better day. Later, the grandest cathedral in the world was built on the site believed to be Peter's burial place. But if Mark had been asked to contribute to that monumental fundraising, he likely would not have given a single coin. Thankfully, that effort came centuries after Mark's time. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus' family does not appear in a better light than the apostles. Unlike Matthew and Luke, Mark includes no infancy story, so the entire Christmas narrative is absent. Instead, the so-called Holy Family seems embarrassed by Jesus, thinking he has lost his senses, and they attempt to pull him away from public attention. Immediately after listing the 12 ending with Judas Iscariot, who handed him over, Mark 3:19, Mark continues, Mark 3:19, 21, 31-35. Then Jesus went home, and once again, a crowd gathered, making it impossible even to eat. When his family heard about it, they set out to restrain him, for people were saying, "He is out of his mind." Then his mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent for him, and called him. A crowd sat around him, and they said, "Your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you." But he replied, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking at those seated around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother," the Holy Family. Not in Mark's account. Does Judas appear much worse than Jesus' own relatives? The same dismissive attitude is shown toward Jesus' hometown, Nazareth. Mark 6:21-26. Judas Iscariot fits seamlessly into Mark's negative depiction, not only of the apostles, especially Peter, but also of Jesus' family and community. So what is Mark aiming at here? Mark was the first evangelist of the expanding Gentile Christian church, which had grown increasingly estranged from the Jewish Christian church, rooted in Jesus' original disciples. In that light, it becomes less surprising that Mark sharply criticizes the 12 and even the Holy Family. One recalls the tension already visible in Paul's writings, Galatians 1:15-19, 2:1-14. Should we really expect the gospel of the Gentile church to speak more positively than Paul himself did about Peter Cephas, whom Paul said he opposed to his face, because he stood self-condemned, or about the circumcision, faction, this hypocrisy, and those who were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, not to mention the false believers who opposed Paul in Jerusalem? Paul had explicitly warned against accepting any gospel other than his own, Galatians 1:6-9. Given this, one would expect a Gentile Christian gospel to be anything but favorable toward those Paul had criticized so severely. The way Paul portrays the 12 Cephas, and John, particularly Peter Cephas, and the Holy Family through James, matches well with Mark's negative picture of the apostles, Peter, and Jesus' relatives. It should come as no surprise. This raises the question, however, whether Mark's portrayal truly does justice to these figures or whether they were shaped, perhaps unfairly, by the theological agendas of Paul and Mark. And if that is the case, what does it mean for Mark's presentation of another member of the 12, Judas Iscariot? The Gospel of Mark has often been described as a passion narrative with a lengthy introduction. This description highlights the way Mark directs attention to the cross, long before narrating the crucifixion itself. Very early in the story, the plot against Jesus is introduced, Mark 3:2-6. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, to destroy him. From that point, the latter half of Mark is marked by repeated predictions of Jesus' suffering and death, expressed in such explicit detail that even Peter found them disturbing. Mark 8:31-32. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. Later, as they descended from the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus again alluded to his resurrection when speaking to Peter, James, and John, who had accompanied him there. Mark 9:9. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them not to tell anyone what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, wondering what rising from the dead could mean. Had he not already told them that he would rise again after 3 days? The Judas of the New Testament, Judas Iscariot, is if not the most famous, then certainly the most infamous member of Jesus' inner circle. He was one of the 12 apostles who remained with Jesus through hardship until the end, until the moment came either to deny him 3 times before the rooster crowed twice, to flee in fear back to Galilee, or, in Judas's case, to betray him. Was Judas simply carrying out biblical prophecy, fulfilling God's plan that Jesus should die for the sins of humanity, even acting on Jesus' own instruction? Why else would he single Jesus out to the Jewish authorities with a kiss for 30 pieces of silver? What picture do the New Testament Gospels, and later the Gospel of Judas outside the New Testament, give us of this act? Jewish and Gentile confessions. To understand how Judas is portrayed in the New Testament Gospels, we must first understand the Gospels themselves. They were products of their own era, written in the final third of the 1st century, serving the needs of the early churches. Their purpose was not primarily historical record, but testimony, Christian witness to Jesus, gospel, the good news. They were composed to persuade and evangelize rather than to provide neutral information. The evangelists shaped the traditions they recorded so as to communicate the message they wished to emphasize. Since nearly everything we know about Judas comes from these Gospels, it is necessary to grasp this evangelizing method before attempting to look back half a century to consider the historical Judas. Jesus' public ministry was directed mainly to Jews, and his followers were themselves Jewish. Those who experienced the Spirit at Pentecost after Easter were Jews from across the ancient world, gathered in Jerusalem to celebrate a Jewish festival. Judas himself belonged to this deeply Jewish setting out of which Christianity emerged. Judaism was, and still is, a deeply impressive ethical monotheistic faith, admired not only by Jews, but also by Gentiles. Many respected the high moral standards of the Jewish community and valued their style of worship, which was practiced throughout the Roman Empire. Rather than relying on animal sacrifice limited to the temple in Jerusalem, Jewish worship centered on inspiring readings from their sacred scriptures in Hebrew, followed by explanations in the everyday language of the congregation. Gentiles often attended these synagogue gatherings, the Greek word synagogue meaning assembly. Yet few were willing to convert fully to Judaism and become proselytes, since conversion required circumcision and strict adherence to the Jewish way of life. For many, Judaism seemed to demand too many sacrifices, including withdrawal from much of their community's social life. Instead, they preferred to participate in synagogue services on the Sabbath, while living normally the rest of the week. Such Gentile attendees were known as God-fearers, but they were not considered Jews. It was among these God-fearers that Paul found his most receptive audience. They were drawn to the ethical ideals of Judaism, but reluctant to embrace its ritual demands. Paul offered exactly what they sought, a faith grounded in high moral vision, free from sacrifices and restrictive social rules. Baptism, after all, was far more appealing than circumcision. As a result, the Gentile Christian church flourished, quickly outnumbering the small and fading Jewish Christian community still centered in Galilee. When Barnabas began his mission in Antioch, he enlisted the help of the most notable convert since Easter, Paul, formerly a Pharisee from Tarsus on the southern coast of modern Turkey. Paul was a Jew raised in the Gentile world, and he brought that background into his ministry. Together, Paul and Barnabas took Titus, a Gentile convert, to Jerusalem as a living example to persuade the leaders of the Jewish Christian church that an uncircumcised Gentile could still be accepted as a true Christian. The Jerusalem leaders eventually agreed, acknowledging that Paul and Barnabas had the right to continue their mission among Gentiles, while they themselves remained focused on outreach to Jews. In return, Paul promised to organize collections among the Gentile churches to support the poor within the Jerusalem community. The ecumenical agreement established by the Jerusalem Council proved challenging to carry out in the diverse congregation at Antioch. In practice, Paul and Barnabas had abandoned the traditional Jewish custom of eating only with Jews to maintain ceremonial purity. Instead, they shared meals with everyone in the congregation, refusing to separate the Lord's Supper. Even Peter, during a visit from Jerusalem, joined in with this inclusive practice. However, James, the brother of Jesus, who had by then assumed leadership of the Jerusalem church, sent representatives to Antioch insisting that Jewish Christians should eat only at Jewish tables to preserve their purity, even in a mixed congregation. Under this pressure, Peter withdrew to dine separately, and even Barnabas followed his lead. Paul, however, refused to compromise. He openly opposed the idea that Jewish purity laws were a condition for salvation, and from that point forward carried out his missionary work independently, without the backing of the Antioch church or Jewish Christianity. From Paul's time onward, the divide between Jewish and Gentile Christianity only deepened. The inclusiveness envisioned at the Jerusalem Council was replaced by the dominance of the larger and wealthier Gentile church, which in turn dismissed the small Jewish Christian community as heretical. By the 4th century, Epiphanius, bishop of Salamis in Cyprus, condemned Jewish Christians as heretical sects known as the Ebionites and the Nazarenes. Ironically, these names originally referred to Jesus and his followers, the poor and those from Nazareth. In truth, the Jewish Christians were simply continuing their Jewish way of life, while also following Christ, just as Jesus himself had done. Surely, they would not be considered heretics today. Jewish and Gentile Gospel, Essene, the generation following Paul, both Jewish and Gentile Christians, began gathering their cherished memories of Jesus into written Gospels. The Jewish Christians produced what is known as the Sayings Gospel Q, while the Gentile Christians created the narrative Gospel of Mark. One major reason why the Sayings Gospel Q was never included in the New Testament is that the New Testament ultimately became the book of the Gentile Christian church, not that of the Jewish Christian church. We know of the Sayings Gospel Q only because, as a final gesture of ecumenical cooperation, both groups chose to combine it with the narrative Gospel of Mark into single works, each shaped by their own viewpoint. Matthew presented it from the perspective of the Jewish Christian church, while Luke did so from the Gentile Christian perspective. As a result, modern scholars have been able to reconstruct the Sayings Gospel Q with considerable accuracy, even though no manuscripts survived, since the Gentile church eventually stopped copying it. Interestingly, the Sayings Gospel Q makes no mention of Judas at all. By contrast, the narrative Gospel of Markandeya, later the other New Testament Gospels, introduced the familiar account of Judas leading the authorities to the Garden of Gethsemane to arrest Jesus. Yet this well-known story deserves fresh scrutiny, particularly in light of the discovery of the Gospel of Judas. Even before that text resurfaced, Mennonite scholar William Klassen had undertaken such a re-examination in his 1996 book, Judas, Betrayer, or friend of Jesus. All this compels us to re-examine the traditional view of Judas in order to properly understand the Gospel of Judas. To do so, however, we must first take a closer look at the New Testament Gospels themselves, the sources from which both the deep hostility toward Judas and the beginnings of a more sympathetic view of him have emerged. Our exploration begins with the first Gentile Gospel, the Gospel of Mark. The Gentile Gospel of Mark, Mark's account. Jesus' closest disciples are depicted as deeply lacking in understanding and certain about who he truly was and what his mission involved. This raises a question. Why did they follow him at all? Or perhaps more importantly, why did Mark choose to portray them in this way? Let's look at how Mark describes them and consider the reasons behind it. After presenting the parable of the sower, a parable, simple enough for anyone to grasp, Jesus turns to his disciples in astonishment. Mark 4:13. Do you not understand this parable? Then how will you understand all the parables? Mark then includes an entire chapter of parables, but even there, Jesus is shown carefully explaining them in private, almost as if the disciples cannot comprehend on their own. Mark 4:33-34. With many such parables he spoke the word to them, as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples. Yet despite all this instruction, they still fail to grasp who Jesus is. Mark 4:40-41. Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great awe, and said to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?